call, make sure we get them admitted into the room. Thank you for joining us. My name is CJ Kamick, Superintendent of Fremont Unified. As a reminder, our meeting is being streamed, and I know we will have one or two members of our Budget Advisory Task Force that might be joining us late, so we'll look forward to welcoming them onto the call when we get there. As you recall from our previous meeting, I'm sorry, let me back up one moment. As this meeting is being streamed, if there's any public comment, that can be done through emailing Ms. Sandoval. In terms of this meeting, as you'll recall from our prior discussion, which I believe was last week, even though many days blend together at this point in time, we talked about reviewing what is the primary focus of our Budget Advisory Task Force and looking back at the original purpose that was created and written for the work of this group, analyzing that further and seeing if we should be making modifications as we move forward. And this is my summary, so please, if there's other perspectives, I welcome that. But based on my recollection, that we would then be looking forward to say, how do we refine the scope and an action plan of the Budget Advisory Task Force so that we can make sure the work we're doing is meaningful and the products that we are creating are tangible. Is there any questions or concerns about that as the framework of our discussions today from this group? Okay. So moving forward, what I'd like to do is just move through the document, and Ms. Sandoval has sent that document out to all of you. And we can, Ms. Sandoval, would you want to do a screen share on that shared document? Please. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate everybody who took the time to review this. And for those of you who added comments and feedback, I think what we'll do is just take it section by section and see where the discussion takes us. So in the initial opening, we very clearly see there that the district and the Office of the Superintendent is establishing this task force to build awareness and understanding of the district budget. And I think here's an interesting highlight, as well as recommend ideas to the board for building the 2021 budget. And the Budget Advisory Task Force is advisory and shall not participate in any capacity in district personnel or operation matters. And that's an important point, because I know in our last meeting we talked very carefully and passionately about the implications of budget reductions and what that does to respective labor groups and also the morale of any organization. So there are some proposed amendments here from our task force members, and that is the first one being that the Budget Advisory Task Force should focus on helping the administration with strategic long-term budget models rather than trying to help solve the short-term gaps year to year. And so as I read that to say that we should be adopting a longer-term budget strategy as part of our generalized direction. The second amendment is to move away from continual line item conversations and look at overall programs and structures in place to discuss priorities. Clarify in the last sentence, since it felt like we were repeatedly told these two categories made up the whole budget, so we'll need to reframe the conversation. That I look at as saying, and I would welcome the people on the call who may have contributed these amendments. One being to say, let's not look so in such isolation at one line item part of the budget and look more holistically at programs and budget structures. So is there any feedback from the group on those amendments? Feedback, yes, that was feedback, but any input from the group on those proposed amendments? I'm sorry. Yes, I have a hand raised. Preeti?
Yeah, I mean, they both seem to be definitely very positive feedback and in shaping the conversation for the future. Um, and both these comments seem to be in strategically focused. And I think from like in the past few meetings that I attended, it was always about that labor makes up 89 or 90% of the spend. So let's not look at that line item. So I guess that the challenge is that it's difficult to look at programs without looking at labor. So it doesn't mean specifically identifying an individual, but just looking at the spend by programs in the context of labor. So not to pick on anybody. I think that is the purpose, but to see where are we spending and, you know, whether it's per student basis or per program basis, and whether is there any opportunity to relook at that spend.
Thank you. And so if I'm hearing you correctly, it is a suggestion that as we look at this work that we're doing as a budget advisory task force, recognizing that for most school districts on average, 84 to 90% of their budget is spent on personnel. And if we are looking at that, it's not to look at individuals, it's to look at how are we allocating our resources in alignment with our goals. And that may include, I think is one of the comments we heard last week, what do our programs entail? And oftentimes our programs are also a big part of our personnel. Those are conversations that we would want to be looking at. That's what I'm hearing.
You framed it in a much better way than I did, so of course.
I think you did great. I just wanted to make sure I captured it accurately.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So
Um,
not to shy away from it is my concern. Let's not shy away from it. Let's put that up on paper and let's gather all the data that we need for that.
okay. Other Trustee Jones.
Yeah, I agree with what's been said, and I like the way that the part in red has been worded, because I do want to see us focusing on, you know, how we build a budget. But I also think that we need to be realistic that in the next 3-year time frame, I'm projecting here, is that we are looking at serious budget shortfalls very likely. And so I don't want this committee not to be tapped into when we are trying to solve budget problems. So while I think the focus is how do we build a smart budget, we also do have to keep in mind that at least in the short term, building that budget is going to involve dealing with some really really big challenges and shortfalls in our expected revenue.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we would want to highlight that duality of the budgets that we are doing. We know under the law we're required to have a 3-year projection, and we can look at our own internal data and past performance related to our budgets to help inform those, as well as using the state and school services and Department of Finance dartboards, but also understanding that we may have to pivot very quickly in terms of dealing with a shortfall in revenue from the state. I've got 2 more hands, so let me move to those. Victoria?
Thank you, CJ. I always love following Trustee Jones because she makes me feel so positive. I would just offer on the personnel side, so something that might just be reframing or shifting the conversation wouldn't be, oh, we need less teachers, but it might be that this committee really feels that we need pre-K, kinder, TK to be class sizes 15, and we really believe that secondary can be as maxed out as possible. Or conversely, that the board is reducing elementary in a discretionary way, doing somewhat better than the contract language. And maybe this committee feels that based on performance, we need much smaller class sizes in secondary math and secondary ELD courses. So while it wouldn't be saying we should no longer spend 80-something% of our budget on personnel, but instead talking about how we want to prioritize spending and services for our kids. So I think that we can do one without necessarily doing the other.
Thank you. I think that's a good summary and an important point that we always have to keep in mind, because it's very simple in context, but it's that example of how do we reallocate the resources that we already have, because we oftentimes are not going to experience any more resources. And I think you're describing very well how we might have to shift things forward in the future, especially to meet the desires of Fremont Unified based on the limited resources. I have one more hand. Saikat?
Yes, hi. So I think Victoria just sort of very succinctly put it, what I was going to say as well. I think where the task force needs to focus on is almost helping the FUSD to create a bottoms-up approach to the budget in the long term as to what students need, and then build up the cost base based on what they need and how and what kind of infrastructure they need for their success. And whether it be down the road a long-term model which shows an increase in the budget or a reduction in the budget, I think the outcome will then determine how the district raises the necessary funds or makes curtailments to its cost base. I think that's where the focus should be from this task force.
Thank you. And I know there's some other resources we could draw upon for some of that discussion. There's been some recent work done by CSBA and other organizations which highlight what it might cost in order to provide students the full scope of education, which we believe they might need. And there's a significant number behind that. But taking it from that larger global context to the more local level, I think we can take that feedback and frame almost in the idea of backwards planning. What do we think our students need to be successful? And then from there, what kind of staffing and resources do we need for our personnel to help those students be successful, and start framing our thinking in that direction. In terms of this first box, are there any objections to, as I'm looking back at my notes here, looking at working into this initial opening a lens of a strategic long-term focus to the Budget Advisory Task Force, and then adding in language that might also support an analysis of larger programs and structures as it relates to our intended allocation of resources in alignment with our goals. Is there any objection to building those two things into our language? Sorry, it takes me a second to go back and scroll through the gallery view so I know if somebody's shaking their head yes or no. I'm not seeing any objections. Can we do a quick check-in for consensus and just give me a thumbs up if everybody can live with working those things into our budget framework? All right, it looks like we've got consensus across the screens. Thank you very much. So we'll move from there to our next section. Ms. Sandoval, if you could scroll down to the, oh, you already have my, no. So moving to what will the task force do? The purpose of the task force, I'm going to review them quickly, is to not just read them. Develop understanding, budget and financial issues, input on local priorities, and I think this is something we talked about above a little bit, recommendations on fiscal and program priorities, contribute to improved communication to enhance understanding, contribute to and support a transparent and collaborative budget process, and recommend to the Board of Education through the superintendent ideas related to reducing expenditures or increasing revenues. So this highlights some of what we talked about above, but it's a little bit more prescriptive. And there's one proposed amendment there that the first bullet point needs to be better defined. We go way into the weeds. And the second part of that is improved communication with who. So I think as we look at that first bullet point, develop an understanding of district's budget and financial issues. Defining that better could mean a few different things. Is there input from the group of how we might further define that statement to help focus our work? So one place where I think we may be able to define that a little bit further, and this may be something that everybody on the task force is already very much aware of. I'm not sure. I am making some assumptions here, which is understandably risky, but being new to an organization, sometimes that's what I'm left with. And sometimes under the develop an understanding of the budget, I think it is also important to make sure that we, if we haven't, that we set a common understanding of the budget development process from the state to the local level. And I don't want to go reiterate that discussion if it's already taken place, but it may be something that we can help define a little bit better. And then that may help us as well, because when we talk about our financial issues, those can be very wide ranging. So I have two hands to add to this conversation. We'll start with Victoria and then Trustee Crosby.
I mostly just raised my hand because I didn't see anyone else, and I figured as the person who put it there, I should volunteer to speak on it. And I would definitely be curious to hear what parents and others on the committee thought about this, because if I'm in the minority, then I did not want to dictate this. I think from my end, we spent almost all of the time looking at individual kind of line items, ranging anywhere from millions of dollars to tens of thousands of dollars. And we never ended up honing in on what actually would be up to discretionary or what actually could be subject to prioritization. So I think my main interest, I'm a math teacher, so I am happy to spend as much time line item by line item. That wouldn't be my concern, but I want people to feel like they're getting out of the task force the larger picture, which is being able to weigh in and discuss kind of meatier things regarding the priorities of the district.
And Trustee Crosby, thank you, Victoria.
Well, to the first bullet, develop an understanding of the district's budget and financial issues. I think it's one of the challenges we have is a lack of understanding of everything that goes into the budget to begin with. And that leads to a lot of misunderstanding of what can and can't be done. So for me, I see for myself as a trustee that it's helpful for me to have a full understanding of this. And if that is a presentation or a Q&A, whatever, then I go out into the community. So for me as a trustee, the community is sort of where I'm connecting. So that may mean parents, it may mean the Chamber of Commerce, it may be, Niles Rotary. It could be almost anything for a trustee. For FUDTA, it would be, your unit members, same for CSEA, SEIU. For the parents, it would be parent groups. And then to be able to have those conversations. I think one of the biggest challenges for the district is how to communicate to people in a way that everyone receives the information. And for us as this committee, we have an idea of how to reach our own, group, whoever that might be, whether it's through council PTA or specific PTA and PTO meetings, whatever that would be, whether you know that there's private conversation groups, WeChat or, Patch or whatever it is, to be able to have those conversations and help get out that information, and also take questions so that you're hearing XYZ, you can bring that to this committee and say, I'm getting these questions. I don't really know how to answer them. So I need a better understanding about the budget in this way, so then I can disseminate that information. So our being able to have a better understanding about the budget and finance allows us to then help everyone in the community understand how it all works. Because I think we have a lot of consternation that is around things that we sometimes have absolutely no control over. And for people to understand that and communicate that out is helpful.
Thank you very much. And I think that can be a big part of it, Trustee Crosby, is when we develop that understanding. I think the more we can develop a shared framework of a dialogue, much like we would in aligning curriculum vertically throughout a school site. If we have a process by which our students regularly refer to a certain set of terms and understandings year to year as they progress, the more we can build a common language and understanding around the development of our budget from the state level to the local level. And then also, I think, as Victoria was describing, a much more common understanding of these are the allocations resources, or these are the pots of money, so to speak. And these are the ones that are able to be reprioritized. These aren't, and making sure that we all, especially as a part of this task force, can separate some of the kind of the fact versus the fiction behind those things. I think is certainly something we could better articulate in the purpose of the task force here, and define a little bit better. Just to go through the remainders, we see provide input on local priorities, and as needed develop recommendations to get to a balanced budget. I think if there's not a large objection from the group, or we could certainly have room for discussion for it, I think that second bullet and the last bullet kind of run together, in my opinion. We're talking in the second bullet about developing recommendations on fiscal and program priorities to ensure a balanced budget. And ultimately, that's kind of what we're talking about in the last bullet as well. The difference being that the last bullet is specific to recommending to the Board of Education through the superintendent these ideas. And I think we may be able to find some contribution there, not contribution, but some ability to combine some of those things. But I don't want to suggest that or move forward with anything without discussion. Trustee Crosby, I see your hand.
I would hope that for this committee, or actually for the district as a whole, that one of our goals is to have a very focused budget and not just a budget that's balanced. You can balance a budget and not meet anyone's needs. So if somehow, and I think maybe the final bullet does a better job of getting closer to that, but even that doesn't really call out, what would be a successful budget. Whereas your goal is not just to balance, but to increase or decrease as necessary to meet what your needs are, to meet the needs of educating students. So if somehow we could have it more targeted towards balancing for the purpose of educating students.
Okay. Other feedback on this area in terms of either maybe trying to combine those, and if I'm hearing that, Trustee Crosby, maybe if we combine those to add in more of a lens to a focused budget, and trying to further identify that as you described, it's not just passing a balanced budget, it's how well does that budget really align with the goals of FUSD and serving our students. Any other thoughts for the group on any of the other bullets as well? Sekat?
Yeah, hi. As a parent of two FUSD students, one of the main things that I would like to see come out of this task force is that we have better communication of what the needs are of the of FUSD and communicate that to the parent body as well, so that they also understand the reasons behind, let's say, a cut in a program or shortening a program or reallocating uh, some resources away from some schools or some teachers or some classrooms. Right now, there is quite a bit of chatter in multiple communication platforms, be it Telegram, be it WhatsApp, around how things are being communicated and perceived by the parent body. And I think the task force would do well to advise the, the FUSD management team in how better to communicate the budgetary constraints and the resource, how the resources are being allocated or reallocated to the overall parent body. So I think there should be a greater emphasis on the third bullet item in terms of the improved communication.
So a clarification of the improved communication and what that might include to the community, to the parents, and likely also in many ways to the staff as well. I think if I'm hearing that correctly, it's helping to create a better understanding of here's how much money in a large context. Here's how much money Fremont Unified School District receives, and a digestible version of here's how we're allocating those resources to support our goals, and here's where we may need some additional help and support, and here's why we did some of those things.
Exactly. I think you put it really well.
Okay. So that is definitely something that we can work on internally. And then I think also with the task force, we can help bring some of those things forward as communication points and reviewing what that communication looks like. And we can look at it from a different lens of all of the representatives on this task force, and going back to the prior discussion, as if we're building a good common language around the budget, it should be something that when we deliver that message outward, everyone on the task force here should have a clear understanding of what we're talking about, which will likely yield to a better understanding for our larger community as well. Okay, and I really thank you, Ms. Sandoval, for keeping those notes on that document as we move forward. I've got to get back to the other screen. My apologies. So I think that the next section is goals, and that will likely lead us to some good conversations, some of which we may have already overlapped. But in terms of goals, we did have some suggestions, and I'll give everybody just a few minutes to read the goals to themselves so they don't have to listen to my voice the entire time. Okay. And as we look at this section for goals, there's two proposed amendments. In light of our last meeting discussions, the task force should allocate subgroups to address compensation related items versus others. Compensation related areas should be staffed by union led volunteers rather than any others. The other proposed amendment would be how are goals and purposes different. I think we have everything listed here and on here from our first meeting, and we didn't revisit. So perhaps we can refine these. So I've got some hands here. Let me just jump over to those. Joyce, go ahead.
Hi, on bullet number 2 for goals, I wonder if that should be reworded to include, to be more inclusive of all the employees of the school district.
Okay, so
I mean, instead of it saying teachers, could it be inclusive of all employees, since all of the employee groups are represented on this task force? So it says provide teachers a voice in budgeting. So I would propose it be more inclusive to all the employees.
I think that would be great. I think we could certainly say provide staff voice if that's something that would be agreeable to the group. I think that's encompassing of all of our employees, and we would want to make sure that that encompasses our certificated staff, our classified staff, and our administrative staff.
And then where it said, in light of last meeting discussions, the budget task force should allocate subgroups. This work already exists outside of this task force, so it might need, we might need it to be addressed differently here, because I already do that work in other places. So I'm not sure what the author of the ad, the intent of that was for. Am I making myself clear?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and so I think there are, platforms, Joyce, as you're describing, where we're engaged with our labor groups related to discussions on salary. And so we can articulate that. Trustee Crosby?
I'm just wondering if you want to, instead of having staff, put stakeholder. I think if you're.
I'd be happy with that.
Same. I do too. This isn't about just staff on this task force. So we've got a lot of stakeholders, whether it's staff or parents or students.
Okay, and Saikat?
Yeah, so since I was the author of that comment, this was more of a feedback on the goals, and maybe this didn't come across as succinctly as I thought it would. So I think when we were originally tasked with looking at the budgets for the district, and it has been discussed multiple times before that 90% of the cost is related to headcount. So my recommendation was that since we have already seen somewhat of a long discussion in the last meeting around headcount related costs and decisions, I thought the task force should not, as a group, overall group, should be focused on that area. Rather, it should be a subset of that task force, if it is required at all in the first place, to look at those headcount compensation related discussions, and the rest of the group who are not part of that, of the supervisory, the staff representative, the union representatives, they can look at the other areas of the district's budget.
Okay.
And if these discussions are taking place in other places, then the task force now needs to decide whether that should be part of this group's agenda or not.
Preeti?
So I'm actually, I saw, I think Victoria's comment here that what are we basing ourselves off of? Is it purpose or is it goals? If we've already defined our purpose, then let's talk about how we get there. How are we going to achieve that? To me, it's kind of the same thing, but we're just framing it differently. And how do we get there? My suggestion would be to actually have subgroups or smaller groups to tackle one topic at a time and bring it to the wider group, their recommendations on what they looked at, what was the angle they discussed in their own subgroups, and present their assessment, because I feel like 1 hour is almost too short of a time to really go deep into one topic. And if that is indeed what we are aiming towards, then 2 or 3 people together can just look at it, whether it's a program or whether what that program does, or develop an understanding of that program and do that homework and bring that back to the main group, or any other ideas. But at least we have to have a vision of how are we going to get there.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think Victoria's comment is we do have some overlap here, and it is almost kind of overlaps as I see it into 3 areas. One is purpose, the other is goals, and then there are some that sit here what I would describe as agreements. And I think maybe we can repurpose some of that work to focus a little bit more on what are the agreements for how we engage in the process of working on the budget advisory task force, and the rest can kind of go into the purpose or retitle them as goals. Is there any input or thoughts from the group on that? Would there be consensus with a thumbs up from the group of reframing these as kind of agreements for how we engage in the work of the task force, and then creating that secondary category of goals/purpose? See some thumbs up. I don't see any disagreement. Okay, so we'll put that as an action step to move forward with. And as Ms. Sandoval is finishing that notation, I will pull up the next slide. And I think that actually kind of falls right into the discussion we were just having, is those agreements could be shaped into the norm section of this document, because generally that's where we're listing our agreements for how we're going to engage in our work and conduct ourselves as a group and as individuals. And then the remainder is, well, at least the next section is a little more logistics based, of who will be on the task force, the support for the task force, and the facilitators. And then the last piece, which I think we should have some discussion on, is how often will the task force meet? And all meetings open to the public, held from 3:30 to 4:45. And at some point in time when it is safe to do so, we'll be back in the boardroom. And the dates that we have now include a date in September, October, November, December, January. So we have each month lined out. And I think there are some things within our budget development process, which I would want to make sure that we are careful of as we plan this. And there are dates that we don't necessarily have yet. So if we can, to the best that we can, hold these dates, but understand that some may move. And to give you more information on what I'm describing, I would look at the January date as an example. We generally look in January, depending on where it falls. Could sometimes be the second or the third week of January, where we are traveling to the school services workshop on the governor's budget proposal. And so I think it would be important that the budget advisory task force come together after we go to that workshop and we have received that information and can share the summary with the task force. In addition, I think that the May date, we would want to put an asterisk by and consider where that date falls. significant date there as well, as you all know, is we get the May revise. So as noted above, we get the governor's budget proposal in January. We get the May revise in May. And as you probably know, those come out from the state, and there's about 2 or 3 business days before we have a large scale workshop to digest all that information. And those are really 2 key points in our budget development process. And then the other date, Mr. Battle, if you could maybe give us some more context on this. I think another important date, again, being cognizant that we don't want to just regurgitate presentations that are made publicly at the board level, but another significant part of the process. There's 2 more dates that I see as significant. One is the actual budget adoption, which would come in June. And the second is rounding out our unaudited actuals, where we close all the books from the prior year. And those might be dates that we'd want to keep in the month that we have set, but adjust the timing a little bit to make sure that's information our task force can review in depth.
Yeah, what I would offer, I think what I would do is I would like for me and my staff to kind of go through the dates to make sure that they coincide with some of the major deliverables information that would be relevant for this group, like first interim, second interim, budget adoption. I think we already took the unaudited into account when we did September 21st, because I think the week before that, the unaudited would be presented. So it would be, make sense to come to this group right after that. So we'll take a look at these.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't want to close off the conversation too abruptly, but we have reached the end of this document. Are there other revisions that people in the task force would like to see related to the actions of our work, the purpose, the focus of our work, that haven't yet been reflected in this document? Allowing some good wait time.
I mean, I would just like to offer, I guess, a question or comment question. Because I know going into, and I guess this is just a question for everybody, but unfortunately, we are going to be into another realm of budget cutting and reductions. You know, it's something that, you know, we hate to talk about, but right now we're not anticipating any substantial changes to, from what the governor has already proposed in his proposed budget for the next few years with regard to COLA and so forth. So that will continue to have significant impact for us. As we did this year, my plan is probably going to bring a recommendation to the board probably by the February meeting. And there are items, things that are going to happen before then. And I know that the board did give some input that they would have liked to seen a more refined process, more robust process in regard to how we get there and how we get input. So that might be something that we might want to talk about in this group. And it's not actually about making decisions, about how do we get there from point A to point B, and providing input for staff so that we can begin to frame that in a way that takes in everybody's needs on this call, our parents, our community, our board, to make sure that we are providing discussion and sufficient context before we get to February. So that's something that I would just like the group to think about in terms of how do we put that process in context. Now I could put my own process together, but I think part of this collaboration is working to make sure that we're kind of getting input from everybody. If that's something that this task force would like to weigh in on, but I'll just put that out there.
Thank you, Marcus. it looks in looking at the prior meeting dates from last year, that there may be a time for us in the spirit of what you're discussing, Marcus, to build some tentative topics for these months as we look through them,
Yes.
and articulate a plan of communicating certain aspects of the budget and making sure that they're understood. I think especially this year with the provisions of Senate Bill 98 and the learning loss mitigation funding, the ADA process for how school districts are being funded this year. And also, we generally, in a typical sequence, are going to have an LCAP process, which in terms of time and sequence mirrors much of our budget development process as well. And that timing and sequence is off this year because we have our learning continuity plan, which is kind of taking the place for an interim time of our LCAP in terms of accountability to the state level. But I think in terms of building in the framework of the LCFF and the LCAP, not that we need to duplicate the efforts of the LCAP in this group, but I do think we can help articulate a clear message of what the LCFF funding is and where the supplemental funding then falls, and what are some of the restrictions and pieces around there. And again, I wasn't in these conversations last year, so if in reviewing these things they're duplicative of things that have already happened, we obviously won't continue with that. Any other feedback from the task force in terms of refining our purpose, our actions, our agreements? Why we're, oh wait, there's a hand. Sorry, Preeti?
Yeah, I don't have any comments on what has been discussed already, which is great. But I think we should, on the lines of what we were talking about earlier, I think we should talk about the specific topics, specific items that make a plan for, what will be tackled, what will be presented, and how should we go about assessing that information, or whether we need to do some homework and work in subgroups to assess that information before we come in. It would be good to touch on that as well.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it would be, maybe we could open the floor to the task force now to see if there are specific areas of the budget they'd like to see further explored, or I could work with a few representatives and try and come up with a tool that might gather collective feedback from the task force members so we can try and see some patterns and trends. But I would open it up for conversation.
Well, we know at the next meeting, I mean, one of our major topics, and I would imagine we'll be on that topic for a little while, is going to be the unaudited actuals, which is always, it's always an informative item because it is, we have ideas of how we're going to finish the year. And of course, once we close our books, we know exactly how we finished the year. So a lot of times that does lead to further inquiry once we finish that work. So that may be a really good point to jump off in terms of doing further inquiry into some of the other areas we might want to look at. So just offer that as an idea.
Okay, thank you very much. And yes, I think the next topic being unaudited actuals is always a time for a lot of budget education. And I think a part where we can kind of test some of the things that we've already talked about today in terms of how we're delivering that message, how we're communicating that information, and building a shared understanding. Joyce?
Marcus, I just saw your comment in the chat, and I think that pretty much kind of encapsulates why I keep having a problem with this task force being tasked with something they shouldn't be tasked with doing. compensation is governed by contracts and union agreements. So what exactly would a subcommittee be talking about? So I'm curious about you talking about that more.
Well, that was just my question. I saw that on the notes, so I wasn't sure if that was being proposed for to look at have a subcommittee looking at compensation. I'm not sure where that came from, but I was just reminding that those are all governed by contracts or union agreements. So I wasn't exactly sure what the group would do in that regard. So I'm agreeing with you, Joyce. I just posed it as a question.
I think that's what I just wanted you to say.
I think it's a great point, Joyce and Marcus. I think if you're looking at compensation under the lens of a task force, I would push that back towards what are our goals. If in our LCAP or other places we have goals related to attracting and retaining a diverse workforce, attracting and retaining high quality staff, then we may want to look at compensation not in terms of as it relates to negotiated settlements within the district, but where do we rank in the workforce? How are we doing in retaining our employees? How are we allocating our resources in that regard? And some of that obviously leads to compensation, but I think if our task force is going to talk about compensation, it needs to stay outside the realm of the collective bargaining process, which is a very unique and protected right, but it should only stay focused on, if we're talking about compensation, what does it mean in terms of our organizational goals, if that makes sense. That's the only place I would really see it as a larger part of this overall conversation. But I'm one voice in that as well.
Have we got to the point where we've decided at the end of the day, we can have the goals and the mission statement, but our role as an advisory committee will be to report out to the board, to make recommendations to the board, or to just be the connection to our various stakeholders?
I perceive it to be a couple of those things, Joyce. I think it is to be a conduit to our representative stakeholders, but I also think, as is highlighted, it is the opportunity to provide suggestions to the Board of Education through me as the superintendent, so that I can report out to the board the work of the task force, and Mr. Battle can report out the work of the task force, whether it's regarding budget development, budget enhancements, or budget reductions. That's where I see the collective voice of the task force.
Pretty much like our technology advisory committee, where those tech savvy people on those committees are making recommendations sometimes to the board, or sometimes the board seeks their opinion about something they might want to do. Does that make sense too?
Yes.
Okay.
So at this time, I want to kind of circle back, make sure that we've kind of gone over our action steps. One of them being that I will make revisions based on the conversations from today and Ms. Sandoval's notes, and we'll send out to this task force a revised copy of this document, and we'll do it in a way that we can track the changes so everybody can see what's been adjusted and see if we can reach consensus on those revised areas. And then we will begin preparing for our September meeting of discussing information related to unaudited actuals. And if we can, in that scope and sequence, Mr. Battle, for the task force, as we engage in the process of presenting those to the Board of Education, once those presentations are available and posted publicly, we can send them to the task force as well for their review in advance of our discussion. Any other closing comments or thoughts for the good of the order or the overall direction or discussion of our Budget Advisory Task Force?
I had a question for the group as a whole. I don't know if we covered this, but who will be on the task force? Is everybody, that makeup is pretty agreeable to everybody?
Great question, Joyce. I didn't go on to that part because I felt like that had probably already been agreed upon before my arrival, but that's something we can certainly spend a moment looking at. Right now, we
Yeah.
have 2 CSEA members, 2 management members, 2 FUTA members, 2 SEIU members, 2 students. All of those groups that I just listed, those representatives would be appointed by their respective groups. 2 trustees appointed by the board, 3 parents appointed by the superintendent, and 2 business civic community members appointed by the superintendent. So our participants are there. If there's agreement, then we can keep those. We may need to go back and make sure if we're filling all of those spots as well.
Okay.
But I'd be open to conversation if we feel like we should be making adjustments there.
Oops, sorry, I'll raise my hand.
Go ahead.
I don't have a thought one way or another on this composition. FEDTA's concern would continue to be district-wide, that the school board and public have a transparent process. And this committee, like a couple others we're still working on, like the equity team, it seemed to be comprised based on how the previous superintendent decided, and it wasn't done through the way that other channels are. And there's also kind of discrepancies based on whether something is called a committee, a task force, a team. And so for us, we have contractual language when there's a committee, but it isn't really necessarily transparent. And I would want the school board and the public to know when something comes of a committee or task force that goes through an established process versus in this task force, the superintendent seemed to have rights to pick most of the people, which is not the way that the process normally is done. So I think that would be moreover the concern. I think that this task force has been very highly functioning. So that isn't necessarily a concern about this task force, but just overall that the process is transparent.
Thank you for that feedback. Any other thoughts from the group before we wrap up today? And before we wrap up, Ms. Sandoval, did we have any public comment for our meeting during the meeting?
No, there hasn't been any. I've been monitoring it.
Thank you kindly. Okay. Well, with that, I want to extend my thanks to all of you for joining us today and for our meeting last week. I want to extend again my thanks to the Fremont Unified staff and parent community. The warm welcome I've received has been very heartwarming, and I am honored and privileged to serve as your superintendent, and I look forward to a lot of great work ahead. So thank you very much, everybody, and I wish you a safe and wonderful rest of your day.